It was May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The world was exhaling after 6 years of terror. Bells rang, crowds flooded the streets, flags unfurled like flowers after a long winter. Somewhere in the distance, church choirs were singing again. But not at Fort Deans. Hidden behind the trees of rural Massachusetts, the little prisoner of war camp seemed untouched by celebration. A soft wind rustled through the pines, carrying the faint smell of damp earth and diesel. The gates stood closed, the guard tower unmanned, and a pale sun hung low over the wooden barracks. Inside the fence, 27 German women stood in silence. Nurses, secretaries, translators, faces drawn by hunger and fear. They had gathered to hear the announcement they had been waiting months for. The war was over. Soon they would be sent home. Captain Margaret Sullivan stood before them, a stack of papers under her arm. She had imagined this day often. Freedom for them, relief for her. Yet now, as she looked at the thin, solemn faces before her, she felt no triumph. Only a strange heaviness in her chest. She cleared her throat. Germany has surrendered. You will be processed and returned home within the week. No one spoke. The news hung in the air like smoke. Then, a single voice broke the stillness. Captain Sullivan, a woman said softly. The captain looked up. It was Ingrid Brener, the translator. Tall, fair-haired, eyes pale as morning frost. Yes, Miss Brener. Please, Ingrid said. Let us stay. The words were quiet, yet they landed with the force of a stone dropped in water. The other women stirred, glancing at each other. A few nodded. Captain Sullivan frowned. Stay? You mean here? In the camp? Yes. Ingrid's voice trembled but did not waver. We have nowhere to return to. No families. No homes. Everything is gone. Sullivan looked from face to face. Some women were crying silently. Others stared at the ground. You want to remain prisoners? Ingrid shook her head. Not prisoners. Just safe. The captain didn't answer. She dismissed them gently, then turned away toward her office. As she walked, the spring air felt heavy in her lungs. She thought of her brother, killed 2 years earlier in Italy. She thought of letters home that began, "We regret to inform you," and wondered what safety even meant anymore. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat by the small window of her quarters, listening to the crickets outside, thinking of Ingrid's voice, soft, frightened, but strangely resolute. The next morning, she read through the prisoners' files again. Lotte Kirsch, age 21. Nursing aide. Anneliese Weber, age 24. Clerk, Luftwaffe Communications. Clara Hoffman, age 19. Translator. And Ingrid Brener, 23. Attached to the Ministry of Information. None had fought. None had killed. Yet all had worn the eagle and swastika. All had served a machine built on fear. As the days passed, Sullivan noticed small things. The way they shared every scrap of food. The way they kept their barracks spotless though no one asked them to. The way they flinched at loud sounds, like animals that had forgotten gentleness existed. One afternoon, while she inspected the camp garden, she saw Ingrid kneeling in the soil, planting carrots with careful fingers. You were not ordered to do this, Sullivan said. Ingrid looked up, brushing dirt from her hands. It is better to make something grow than to wait for orders. Something about that sentence stayed with the captain long after she walked away. Winter had been brutal that year. Snow draped over the camp roofs like heavy blankets. Supplies ran low. Some of the younger guards resented having to share rations with prisoners. They called them names when they thought the officers couldn't hear. But one guard, Private James Morrison, barely 20, didn't. He was quiet, soft-spoken, a farm boy from Iowa. When he saw one of the women shivering at roll call, he slipped his own gloves into her hands. You'll need these more than me, he said. She stared at him as if he'd handed her fire. From that day, Morrison became a bridge. He taught them English in the evenings, awkwardly at first, holding up objects and naming them, laughing when they mispronounced things. They taught him German songs in return. By Christmas, something remarkable happened. The women began to sing Still Nacht in their barracks, their voices soft and uncertain. Outside, the guards heard the melody and joined in with Silent Night. 2 languages, 1 song. The air seemed to shimmer with something fragile and almost holy. Captain Sullivan stood at her window listening, her breath fogging the glass. She whispered, "If my brother could hear this." In January, The Red Cross delivered news from Europe. Cities burned. Families scattered. Germany was rubble. The women huddled together reading scraps of newspapers. Some wept. Some stared blankly. One fainted when she saw the photograph of Dresden, her home, nothing but black ruins. Then came the news no one was prepared for: the camps. The Americans posted the first photographs on the mess hall wall. The prisoners of Fort Deans were told they should see what their country had done. At first, they refused. Then, one by one, they looked. The images were unbearable. Piles of bodies, eyes empty. Survivors staring at the camera like ghosts. Ingrid fell to her knees. "No," she whispered. "This is not possible." "It is," Captain Sullivan said quietly. "I wish it weren't." For 3 days, the women barely spoke. The guards avoided their eyes. The air in the camp changed, thick with shame and disbelief. On the 4th day, Ingrid went to the chapel and sat alone. Morrison found her there, hands clasped, eyes hollow. "How do you go on?" she asked him, after seeing such things.
"You start small," he said. "You help someone. You tell the truth. You plant something in the ground and watch it grow." She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then maybe I will plant carrots again." And she did. Every morning, she worked in the garden. She began writing, too, pages filled with guilt, with questions, with tiny glimpses of hope. "They told us we were chosen," she wrote in her diary. "But I think the only chosen ones are those who choose kindness." When the war ended, the camp received orders to repatriate all prisoners. The news spread fast, but there was no celebration. The women gathered in silence outside their barracks. Ingrid spoke for them all. "We cannot go back to a land of ghosts," she said. That night, Captain Sullivan sat at her desk, the repatriation form spread out before her. She stared at the empty signature lines and thought of the singing at Christmas, the gloves, the garden. She wrote a letter to her superiors. "These women have changed," she wrote. "They are not our enemies. They are proof of what mercy can do." Weeks later, a reply came. Some of the women could remain, temporarily, as displaced persons. 9 were chosen. The rest left in trucks, waving from the windows, their faces wet with tears. The 9 who stayed stood by the empty barracks as the engines faded. They were free, but freedom felt like loss. That night, they sang again, very softly, under the stars. Morrison listened from the gate. Captain Sullivan listened from her quarters. And though none of them said a word, all understood that something sacred had happened in that forgotten corner of Massachusetts. It was not victory. It was something gentler. Something that might, one day, heal the world. Spring returned to Massachusetts with hesitant warmth. The snow melted in slow surrender, turning the dirt paths of Fort Deans into brown rivers that carried away the last footprints of winter. The barbed wire fence had been taken down weeks ago, though its shadow still lay across the ground like a scar. The women who remained, Ingrid, Clara, Lotte, Annalise, and 5 others, were no longer prisoners, but they did not yet feel free. They lived in the same barracks, slept in the same bunks, and woke at the same hour, as if their bodies could not forget the rhythm of captivity. Captain Sullivan had been reassigned to oversee their transition into civilian life. She had fought against the bureaucracy that wanted them gone, arguing that they needed time to heal, to find purpose. Washington had reluctantly agreed. The women were given small jobs, some helped at a nearby hospital, others cleaned offices or tended fields. Ingrid worked at the town's infirmary, translating letters and medical records for German immigrants. She walked there each morning, a gray shawl around her shoulders, her hair tucked neatly beneath her cap. The people of the town watched her with curiosity. Some turned away when she passed. Others greeted her shyly. A few spat on the ground after she went by. She never answered their anger, she only kept walking. One afternoon, while she was sorting through a pile of documents at the infirmary, a nurse approached her with a thin envelope. "For you," the nurse said. It came with the Red Cross mail. Ingrid stared at it for a long moment before taking it. The handwriting was shaky but familiar. She broke the seal carefully. It was from her mother. The letter was brief, written from a refugee camp in Hamburg. Our home is gone. Your father was taken by the Russians. I do not know if he lives. I am alive, but very tired. If you can come home, come soon. Ingrid folded the paper slowly. Her hands trembled. For the first time in months, she cried openly. That evening, she walked to the garden behind the barracks. The soil was soft, still cold from winter. She knelt and began to dig with her bare hands, feeling the dirt pack under her nails. Captain Sullivan found her there, her face streaked with tears. Another letter, the captain asked gently. Yes, Ingrid said. From my mother. She is alive. Sullivan smiled faintly. That's good news. It is, Ingrid said, and it isn't. She asks me to come home. Will you? Ingrid looked down at the soil. I don't know if I have a home anymore. The captain didn't reply. She crouched beside her and began to help, scooping the soil in silence. The two women worked until the sun dipped below the trees, the earth between them rich and dark. That night, Ingrid wrote in her diary. The war ended, but I am still standing in its shadow. Each kindness feels like a fragile bridge. I cross it slowly, afraid it will collapse. The next morning, a truck arrived at the camp carrying supplies, and Private Morrison, now wearing civilian clothes. His service had ended, but he had stayed on as a volunteer, helping rebuild local farms. When he saw Ingrid, his face lit up. You're still here, he said, smiling. So are you, she answered. They talked for a long while, walking by the fence posts where the wire used to be. Morrison told her about his plans to buy land up north, near Maine. She told him about her work at the infirmary. Their words were cautious, gentle, like children learning to trust the world again. Before he left that day, Morrison handed her a small packet of seeds. For your garden, he said. She turned it over in her hands. Carrots? He laughed softly. Of course. The garden became her refuge. Every evening, after work, she would kneel in the soil, planting, watering, whispering to the earth as if it could listen. Sometimes the other women joined her. They grew vegetables, flowers, herbs. They laughed more now, though sometimes their laughter was edged with sorrow. In May, the townspeople were invited to an open day at the camp, an effort by Captain Sullivan to show that the women were no threat. The townsfolk came hesitantly, clutching their children's hands. At first, no one spoke. Then, one of the women, Lotte, brought out a tray of fresh bread baked that morning. Please, she said in halting English. Eat. An old farmer took a piece. Then another person. The tension began to melt. A local woman asked to see the garden. Ingrid led her there, showing her the neat rows of green. It's beautiful, the woman said. You've done all this yourselves? Ingrid nodded. Yes. The earth forgives faster than people, I think. That line spread through the town like rumor. The next week, a small group of townsfolk began leaving seeds and tools by the camp gate. By summer, the garden had doubled in size. One evening, Sullivan walked through it with Ingrid. You've made this place alive again, she said. Ingrid smiled faintly. No, Captain. You did, when you listened. The captain looked at her. Do you still think of going back? Every day, Ingrid said. But maybe home is not where we start from. Maybe it's where we learn to forgive ourselves. That night, Sullivan wrote a letter to her own family. She had not spoken to them since her brother's death. I used to think forgiveness was weakness, she wrote. Now I think it is the only thing that survives war. By autumn, 2 of the women decided to leave, Annalise to Canada, where her cousin had found work, and Clara to New York to help with translation at an immigration office. The others stayed. The barracks grew quieter. Ingrid often sat by the fire at night, reading English books aloud to Lotte, who was learning the language slowly. They took turns telling stories about their childhoods, about the smells of their villages, the taste of bread before rationing. Sometimes, when the wind blew through the pines, Ingrid closed her eyes and imagined she could hear church bells across the ocean. Then, one evening in late October, a messenger came to the camp. He carried a telegram for Captain Sullivan. She read it silently, her face hardening. Then she called Ingrid to her office. "It's your mother," she said softly. "She's ill. The Red Cross says you should come if you want to see her." Ingrid's breath caught. "When?" "The next ship leaves in 2 weeks." Ingrid sat in silence. The decision pressed on her chest like a weight. She had prayed for this chance, yet now it felt unbearable. Later, she went to the garden. The plants had begun to wither in the cold. Morrison had written her a letter from Maine, enclosing a photograph of his small farm and a note that simply said, "Things grow slowly, but they do grow." She folded the letter into her pocket and knelt in the soil. The earth was cold against her palms. Captain Sullivan came to her after dusk. "You should go," she said gently. Ingrid looked up, her eyes shimmering. "And if there is nothing left when I arrive?" "Then you'll plant something new," the captain said. They embraced quietly, the wind whispering through the empty fence posts. 2 weeks later, Ingrid boarded a ship in Boston Harbor, a single suitcase in her hand. The ocean stretched ahead like a memory waiting to be rewritten. She stood on deck as the ship pulled away, watching the coastline fade into mist. She did not know that Morrison was standing on a nearby pier, watching her leave. He had come without telling her, only to make sure she was safe. When the ship vanished into the horizon, he took off his cap, whispered a prayer, and turned back toward the land they had both learned to call home. The sea was gray and endless. Days blurred into nights, and the ship groaned under the weight of its cargo, refugees, relief workers, soldiers heading home to a continent that no longer existed as they remembered it. Ingrid spent most of the voyage on deck, staring at the horizon. The air smelled of salt and coal smoke, and gulls followed the ship for days, white wings cutting through the wind like scraps of paper. She carried only a single suitcase, her diary, and the packet of carrot seeds Morrison had given her. On the 7th night, a storm rose. Waves crashed over the railings, the sky roaring with thunder. She held onto the deck rail, soaked and trembling, whispering to herself the same words she had whispered during air raids years before: "Stay alive, stay awake, stay human." When the storm passed, the sea lay quiet again, but something in her had shifted. For the first time, she began to feel what she had long feared: she was going home, but she no longer belonged to the world she was returning to. 2 weeks later, the ship entered the harbor at Bremerhaven. The coastline was awound, cranes bent like broken ribs, ships rusting where they had sunk half underwater. Smoke still drifted from the skeletons of warehouses. The passengers disembarked in silence. Some kissed the ground. Others wept. Ingrid stood still, gripping her suitcase. The air smelled of ash and seaweed and something faintly metallic, like the memory of blood. From the harbor, she took a truck inland, then another south, through fields that looked as if giants had walked through them, crushing everything underfoot. Entire towns were reduced to chimneys and rubble. When she reached Hamburg, she found her mother's camp, a cluster of tents on the edge of the city, surrounded by mud and makeshift fences. She found her mother lying on a cot, thin and pale but alive. "Ingrid," the old woman whispered when she saw her. "Mama," Ingrid said, kneeling beside her. They held each other for a long time without words. When they finally spoke, their voices were quiet, as if afraid to disturb the ghosts that filled the air. Her mother told her what had happened, the bombing raids, the night the house collapsed, her father's arrest, the endless hunger. "They say he is alive," her mother said, "but no one knows where." For days, Ingrid helped in the camp, distributing food, fetching water, comforting strangers. Yet she felt an ache she couldn't name. The people around her spoke only of survival, never of forgiveness. When she mentioned the Americans who had treated her kindly, some turned away in anger. "They killed our sons," one man said bitterly. "Don't talk to me of kindness." Ingrid said nothing. But that night, she wrote in her diary, "Kindness does not erase guilt, but it plants something living in the ruins." Weeks passed. Her mother grew stronger. Ingrid found work as a nurse at a nearby hospital run by the Allies. She cleaned wounds, changed bandages, soothed children with fevers. But she could not ignore the looks she received, some grateful, others accusing. One day, while tending to an old man with shrapnel scars, he looked at her uniform badge and said, "You were one of them." "I was," she said quietly. "And now you serve them?" "I serve whoever is in pain," she replied. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Then you are better than most." That night, she dreamed of Fort Deans, the pine trees, the soft hum of "Silent Night," the smell of earth in the garden. She woke with tears on her face. In the morning, she took out Morrison's letter and read it again. Things grow slowly, but they do grow. She folded it back carefully, as if it were sacred. One afternoon, while sorting medical supplies, she met an American officer named Major Ellis. He had kind eyes and a limp from an old wound. He recognized her accent immediately. "You were at one of our camps, weren't you?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "In Massachusetts." He smiled faintly. "I was stationed in Boston." Small world. Over the following weeks, they spoke often. He told her about his family farm in Vermont, about his sister who had married a German immigrant before the war. He never asked her what she had done during the war, he only asked what she hoped to do now. One evening, she said, "I want to rebuild something good. Something that does not vanish when the flags change." He nodded. "Then you already know what peace means." But the peace around them was fragile. Black markets thrived. People disappeared. Former soldiers hid in cellars, afraid of being recognized. The newspapers spoke of trials in Nuremberg, of justice and punishment. Ingrid went to the public square one day to hear a broadcast of the verdicts. The crowd stood in silence as names were read aloud, men who had ordered death as easily as signing letters. When the list ended, someone shouted, "It should have been all of them." The crowd erupted, cheers, curses, tears. Ingrid turned away, her stomach twisting. She knew that anger, and she feared it. The crowd erupted, cheers, curses, tears. Ingrid turned away, her stomach twisting. She knew that anger, and she feared it. She had seen it before on the faces of those who marched in triumph, and again on those who lost everything. It was the same face, only turned in a different direction. Behind her, the women of the camp huddled together. Some pressed against the fence as if to steady themselves, others clutched at each other's sleeves. A few smiled in disbelief, thinking freedom meant forgiveness. Ingrid could not bring herself to join them. "Back to the barracks," Captain Sullivan called. His voice was steady but hollow, as if it came from someone who no longer believed in orders. That night, Ingrid could not sleep. The walls of the barracks felt smaller, the air too thick. Somewhere outside, a radio played dance music, and laughter carried faintly across the field. She thought of the people celebrating, and she tried to imagine what peace must feel like. But for her, peace felt like standing in a room that had just been emptied of sound. At dawn, she slipped outside. Mist hung over the camp, turning the barbed wire into strings of dew. A robin sang from the fence post, its tiny chest rising and falling, oblivious to everything that had happened here. Ingrid walked to the edge of the vegetable plot she had tended all through the war. The soil was dark and soft beneath her fingers. She dug her hands in, feeling its coolness. She whispered, "You remember, don't you?" Behind her, footsteps crunched on gravel. "You shouldn't be out here," said a voice. It was Lieutenant Morrison. His uniform was rumpled, his eyes red from sleepless nights. "I couldn't stay inside," Ingrid said. "It's too loud in there, even when no one speaks." Morrison looked at the rows of plants. "They're saying you'll all be sent back next week. Repatriation, they call it. Sounds cleaner than it is." She nodded, still staring at the soil. "Will you be the one to send us?" He didn't answer. Instead he bent down, picked up a clod of earth, and broke it apart between his fingers. "My mother used to garden," he said. She said it was the only time she felt the world made sense. Ingrid smiled faintly. "Your mother must have been a wise woman. She died before the war." He dropped the soil. "Sometimes I think people like her were lucky not to see what came after." The wind shifted. From the town came the distant sound of church bells. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Morrison said quietly, "If you had the chance to stay, would you take it?" She looked at him, startled. "Stay? Here? Not as a prisoner. As a worker. The farm needs hands. And some of the townsfolk," he stopped, uncertain. "Some might allow it. Captain Sullivan's trying." Ingrid's heart pounded. The idea felt impossible, dangerous, yet something inside her stirred, an ache she had not allowed herself to feel. Why would he do that? Because he thinks mercy is a better monument than revenge. She lowered her eyes. "And you?" Morrison hesitated, then shrugged. "I just think this place deserves to grow something better than memory." He left her then, walking back through the mist. Ingrid stayed, kneeling in the dirt until her hands were black with it. That evening, Captain Sullivan summoned her to his office. The room smelled of tobacco and damp paper. He looked older than she remembered, his hair grayer at the temples. "I've spoken to the command," he said without preamble. "They'll allow a few of you to stay temporarily. For the farms, the hospital gardens, places that need tending." Ingrid's breath caught. "Temporarily? Until the locals decide otherwise." He leaned forward. "They may never forgive you, Miss Brener. But maybe forgiveness isn't the point." She didn't know what to say. Sullivan continued, softer now. "I can't justify everything that's happened here. But I can make sure at least one corner of this land grows something decent again." Ingrid bowed her head. "Then I'll stay." He nodded once, almost to himself. "Good. There's a cottage by the river. It's small, but you'll manage." When she left his office, the sun was setting behind the hills. For the first time, the gates of Fort Deans opened for her not as a boundary, but as an invitation. She stepped through, carrying only a small bundle of clothes and a packet of seeds she had saved from the camp garden. The road to the river was lined with wildflowers. She walked slowly, tasting freedom as though it were something fragile. A few villagers stared from doorways, some with suspicion, others with weary indifference. She kept her eyes down and walked on. The cottage was little more than a shack with a crooked chimney, but the yard behind it held promise, an untamed patch of land waiting for hands to shape it. She dropped her bundle on the floor and went straight to the soil. The next morning she began to dig. Her muscles ached, her palms blistered, but she felt alive. Each furrow she turned was an act of quiet rebellion against the past. She planted beans first, then cabbages, then flowers she had never dared to grow before. Weeks passed. The garden began to sprout, and with it came visitors. At first, curious children who lingered at the fence, then women from the village who offered seeds or advice. Some spoke kindly, others with thinly veiled contempt. Ingrid accepted both with the same calm gratitude. One afternoon, Captain Sullivan arrived carrying a small radio. "Thought you might like some company," he said. She smiled. "Only if it plays something gentle." He laughed, setting it on the windowsill. "No promises." They stood together in the garden as the music crackled to life, a slow, hesitant melody. Sullivan watched her hands moving through the plants. "Do you ever think about leaving?" he asked. "Every day," she said. "And every morning, I plant something new to convince myself to stay." He nodded. "Then maybe that's enough." Summer ripened. The once empty yard turned into a quilt of color. Butterflies hovered, bees droned, and for the first time in years, Ingrid slept through the night. Letters came occasionally, one from Morrison, who had returned home to his family, another from a former camp inmate now living in France. They all spoke of starting over. Ingrid wrote back, telling them about the garden, about the kindness of strangers who slowly learned her name. By autumn, the harvest filled baskets. She carried the first vegetables to the town square, unsure how they would be received. The mayor, a stern man with tired eyes, accepted them without a word. The next week, she found her basket returned, with bread inside. No note. No message. Only bread. That winter was harsh, but she survived. Sullivan visited less often. Eventually he was transferred back to the States. His last letter was brief: "The world is starting over, Ingrid. Keep a piece of it alive for the rest of us." She did. Year after year, through storms and droughts, through the slow rebuilding of a country that had lost its shape. The garden grew, changed, expanded. Children who once stared now helped her plant. Soldiers who once guarded now repaired fences and carried water. Sometimes, when the sun set and the shadows lengthened across the fields, Ingrid would hear the faint echo of that old crowd, the cheers, the curses, the tears. But they no longer frightened her. They were only wind now, moving through the trees. She grew old. Her hair turned the color of the lilac blossoms she loved. Her back bent, but her hands never lost their strength. She kept a small journal, filling it with sketches and thoughts, notes about the weather, the soil, the kindness of visitors. On the final page she wrote, "If someone finds these, let them be planted again." When she died, the townspeople buried her beneath the lilac tree she had planted the first spring after the war. No ceremony, no speeches, only the sound of shovels and birdsong. Captain Sullivan's radio, long since broken, was placed beside her in the earth. Years later, children played above her grave, unaware of the history beneath their feet. The lilac bloomed each spring, fragrant and untroubled. And the soil, faithful as ever, remembered everything without bitterness. The crowd that once erupted in anger was gone, the echoes of it had turned to music, and the land had healed itself through hands that never stopped working. Ingrid had feared that anger, and she was right to. But she learned that fear could be turned to tenderness if given time, and that time itself was the truest gardener of all. So the story ends not in triumph, but in continuation, the gate open, the soil breathing, the world moving forward, quietly, mercifully, as it always must.